Tonight we begin with an oath. In a locked room, on a damp stone floor, a promise was sworn that would bring an entire kingdom to its knees. A promise that would ignite a revolution and change the world. And here's the thing. This oath wasn't made by generals or nobles. It was made by doctors, lawyers, farmers, the forgotten people of a nation about to implode. They stood together, arms raised, and declared that they were the nation. But how does it get to that point? How do the powerless, the silenced, the 98% of a country find the guts to declare war on their own king? To get that, we have to go back to a France that was, for millions, a prison of poverty and injustice. Before we deep dive into the history, my name is Boris, and I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what was the best part of your day? Feel free to share it in the comments below. And if you find comfort or curiosity in these calm history journeys, consider giving the video a like and maybe even subscribing for more. Now, settle in. Let's drift gently into the past. Let's be clear, in 1788, France was the cultural capital of Europe. Its palaces were dripping with gold, its fashion was everything, and its philosophers were changing the world. But this glittering surface was hiding a deep sickness. The entire kingdom was built on an ancient and seriously unfair social structure, the Ancien Régime, the Old Regime. French society was split into three classes, or estates. Think of a pyramid. At the very top, you had the first estate, the clergy. They owned 10% of all the land in France, took money from the poor, and paid virtually zero taxes. Seriously. Right below them, the second estate, the nobility. These guys made up less than 2% of the population, but owned over a quarter of the land. And you guessed it, they were exempt from most taxes too. For them, life was one big party at Versailles, with a side of political maneuvering for the king's favor. And then, at the bottom, holding the whole thing up, was everyone else. The third estate. This wasn't one group. It was 98% of the French population. 27 million people. It was rich lawyers and merchants who were often smarter and wealthier than the nobles. It was city workers in Paris. And most of all, it was millions of peasants, scratching a living out of land that wasn't even theirs. And what did they all have in common? They paid for everything. They paid taxes on land, on salt, on wine, on tobacco. They had to pay their local lord just to use his mill to grind their grain or his oven to bake their own bread. Let that sink in. Presiding over this whole teetering mess was King Louis XVI. Louis wasn't an evil man, but let's be honest, he was tragically bad at his job. He was more comfortable tinkering with locks than dealing with the crisis his kingdom was facing. His wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, became the poster child for royal detachment, a symbol of lavish waste while the people starved. The real problem? The system was broke. Flat broke. The biggest recent expense was helping the American Revolution. A geopolitical win for sure, but a financial nosedive that pushed France to the absolute brink. As the government's money disappeared, a series of bad harvests sent the price of bread into the stratosphere. A worker in Paris might spend half his daily wage on a single loaf of bread. Starvation wasn't a threat, it was real. And the air was getting thick with new ideas from the Enlightenment. Philosophers were writing about liberty, equality, and the rights of man. And people started asking questions. Why should your birth decide your worth? Why should the productive majority be crushed by taxes to support the privileged few? Why should a king rule by divine right, accountable to no one? The mood was best captured in a pamphlet by a clergyman, Abbé Sieyès. It asked a simple question. What is the third estate? Everything. What has it been until now? Nothing. What does it ask? To become something. The people of France were starting to see themselves not as subjects, but as citizens. and they were ready to demand what was theirs. Faced with total financial ruin, King Louis backed into a corner, pulled out a move nobody had seen in 175 years. He summoned the Estates General. This was a medieval assembly representing the three estates, and the announcement in 1788 was met with a massive surge of excitement. For the Third Estate, this was it. This was their chance to be heard, to demand real fundamental change. The king even agreed to let them have double the representatives. So when they all met at Versailles on May 5, 1789, you had about 300 deputies for the clergy, 300 for the nobility, and 600 for the Third Estate. Looks fair, right? Wrong. Here's the catch, a fatal centuries-old catch. The old rules said voting wasn't done by head, but by order. This meant the clergy got one block vote, the nobility got one block vote, and the massive Third Estate, with its 600 deputies representing 98% of the country, also got just one vote. The injustice was insane. The two privileged orders could just vote together, 2-1, to block any reform that made them pay a single dime. The whole thing was a sham. The deputies of the Third Estate knew it. They showed up with one demand. Everyone meets as one body, and every deputy gets one vote. Only then would their numbers mean anything. The king hesitated. The privileged orders refused. The great meeting quickly turned into a bitter 6-week-long stalemate. The commoners had been invited to the palace, but they were still being told to stay in their place. They were about to decide they weren't going to listen anymore. For weeks, the Third Estate deputies were ignored. Their patience was gone. A new idea was taking hold, pushed by figures like Abbé Sieyès. They didn't need the king's permission. They already had their power from the 27 million people they represented. So on June 17, 1789, they did something radical. They voted to declare themselves the National Assembly. It was a breathtaking act of rebellion. They weren't the Third Estate anymore. They were the sovereign voice of the French nation. The king, finally waking up, was stunned. This was a direct challenge to his absolute power. He announced he'd hold a royal session to lay down the law and, in the meantime, ordered their meeting hall locked. Bad move. On the rainy morning of June 20th, the deputies arrived to find the doors barred. But instead of retreating, they found the nearest available space, an indoor tennis court. They streamed into the vast, empty hall. A wave of anger, fear, and patriotic energy swept the room. They knew this was the turning point. Led by their president, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, who stood on a makeshift table, they decided to make their rebellion official. One by one, they raised their right hands and swore, in a thundering chorus, not to separate until the constitution of the kingdom is established. This was the tennis court oath. It was a revolutionary sacrament. They were putting the nation above the king. The question was no longer about procedure. It was about who really held power in France. And on that rainy day in a tennis court, the commoners declared their answer. The war had begun. The king's royal session on June 23rd. A total disaster. He scolded the Third Estate like children and ordered them to disperse. They didn't move. When a royal official came to remind them of the king's order, the fiery Comte de Mirabeau reportedly roared back, "Go and tell those who have sent you that we are here by the will of the people, and that we will not leave except by the force of bayonets." The king blinked. He backed down and ordered the other two estates to join the National Assembly. It was a huge win, but nobody trusted it. While the king was pretending to agree, he was also secretly ringing Paris with soldiers, foreign mercenaries. The people of Paris weren't stupid. They knew what this looked like. A crackdown was coming. The city was a powder keg. The final spark came when the king fired Jacques Necker, his finance minister, and the one guy in government the people actually trusted. That was it. Panic and rage hit the streets. The crowds knew they needed to arm themselves. On the morning of July 14th, they marched on the Invalides, a military hospital, and seized tens of thousands of muskets. But there was one problem. They had almost no gunpowder. They knew where to find it, the Bastille. But here's the thing. The Bastille wasn't just an armory. With its 8 imposing towers, it was a hated medieval fortress in the heart of Paris that screamed royal tyranny. To attack the Bastille was to attack the king himself. The crowd surrounded the fortress. Negotiations with the governor Delaunay failed. He refused to surrender the gunpowder. As the crowd grew impatient, someone managed to lower a drawbridge, and people poured into the outer courtyard. The garrison opened fire. Dozens fell. The mood went from hopeful to vengeful. For hours, a chaotic battle raged. The tide finally turned when a group of mutinous French guards showed up, with cannons. They were professional soldiers, and they sided with the people. It was game over for the governor. Delaunay surrendered. Big mistake. The mob, brutalized and furious, fell upon him. He was stabbed, shot, and his head was sawn off and paraded through the streets on a pike. The fall of the Bastille was an earthquake. When the king heard the news, he asked, "Is it a revolt?" A duke gave the legendary reply, "No, sire, it is not a revolt, it is a revolution." He was right. The king's authority in Paris was gone. So the king has lost his capital, the people have tasted blood, and this thing is escalating fast. If you're enjoying this deep dive, now would be a great time to hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next spreads like fire across the entire country. The news of the Bastille didn't just travel, it exploded into the countryside. This sparked one of the weirdest episodes of the revolution, the Great Fear. It was a bizarre mix of hope and paranoia. Rumors flew that aristocrats had hired thugs to burn the harvest and punish the peasants. These thugs never actually appeared. So the peasants, now armed and organized, turned their anger on the real source of their misery, the feudal system. They stormed chateaux and manor houses, not to kill the nobles, but to find and burn the paperwork. They burned the feudal charters, the rent rolls, the legal documents that had bled them dry for centuries. It was a symbolic act of liberation. By destroying the paper, they were destroying the system. Back in Versailles, the National Assembly watched this with a mix of sympathy and panic. They knew they had to act. The result was the night of August 4th, 1789. In a single feverish all-night session, one deputy after another, nobles and clergy, stood up and renounced their ancient privileges. They gave up exclusive hunting rights. They abolished the Lord's private courts. They eliminated tithes to the church. By morning, they had passed the August decrees. Article 1 stated boldly, "The National Assembly abolishes the feudal system entirely." In one night, they had wiped out a social order that had defined France for 1,000 years. In theory, all Frenchmen were now equal before the law. The war against the old world was being won. With the old system in ashes, the Assembly needed a new blueprint. They had to define what they were fighting for. The result was the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And let's be clear, this is one of the most important documents ever written. It was the revolution's soul on paper. It started with a thunderclap. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. It declared that the government's entire purpose is to preserve the natural rights of man: liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It completely redefined power. Sovereignty, it stated, doesn't come from God to a king. It comes from the nation, the people. This was the death knell of absolute monarchy. It guaranteed freedoms that were unthinkable months earlier. Freedom of speech and press, freedom of religion. It established the rule of law, no more arbitrary arrests, and you were presumed innocent until proven guilty. Now, was it perfect? Let's be honest. The promise of equality didn't extend to women or to the enslaved people in France's colonies. It was a document of its time, written by men of property, but its power was undeniable. It gave the revolution its moral justification and its famous slogan, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. Liberty, equality, fraternity. It was a declaration that the old world was dead. By autumn 1789, the king was stalling. From his palace at Versailles, he still hadn't formally approved the August decrees or the Declaration of Rights. Meanwhile, in Paris, the people were still hungry. The price of bread was still cruelly high. On the morning of October 5th, the women of Paris snapped. They were the ones who had to feed their families, and they had had enough. A young woman beat a drum, and soon a crowd of thousands had gathered, armed with kitchen knives and pikes. Their destination, Versailles. They were going to march 12 miles to take their demands directly to the baker and the baker's wife, the hated Queen Marie Antoinette. When the rain-soaked crowd arrived, they stormed the National Assembly Hall, demanding bread and action. A small group was granted an audience with the king, and he promised them grain. But for the more radical members of the crowd, it wasn't enough. In the early hours of the morning, they found an unlocked gate and broke into the palace itself. All hell broke loose. They surged through the halls, hunting for the queen's bedchamber, screaming for her death. Marie Antoinette barely escaped through a secret passage just moments before the mob broke down her door. The royal family was trapped. The crowd had one unified demand. The king must come back to Paris, where they could watch him. Louis had no choice. On October 6th, a bizarre procession made its way to Paris. At its head were the jubilant women, followed by the royal carriage carrying the king, queen, and their children, who were now, effectively, prisoners. They were installed in the Tuileries Palace. The king wasn't a monarch anymore. He was a hostage of the revolution. For the next 2 years, the revolution entered a weirdly calm phase. The National Assembly got down to the business of building a new France. Their goal was a constitutional monarchy. They churned out reforms. They replaced the old provinces with 83 new departments. They created the metric system. They seized all the church's land and sold it off to pay the state's debts. A smart move that gave a whole new class of people a financial stake in the revolution's success. But then they made a huge misstep with the civil constitution of the clergy, which effectively made the church a government department and required priests to swear an oath to the constitution. This split the country in half. The king, a devout Catholic, hated it. Finally, in 1791, the new constitution was ready. France was officially a constitutional monarchy. The king had limited powers, like a veto, but the real authority was with a new legislative assembly. On paper, it seemed like a workable compromise. Louis even swore an oath to uphold it. But here's the thing. It was a truce built on deep mistrust. The revolutionaries didn't trust the king, and the king definitely didn't trust the revolution. He was playing a double game. Publicly, he was the king of the French. Privately, he was writing secret letters to other monarchs in Europe, begging them to invade and restore his power. The whole grand structure was a house of cards, and the king himself was about to pull one out from the bottom. King Louis felt like a prisoner. Convinced his family was in danger, he decided his only hope was to escape Paris, get to the eastern frontier, and rally loyal troops. On the night of June 20th, 1791, the royal family, disguised as servants, slipped out of the Tuileries. The escape was a comedy of errors from the start. Their coach was big and slow. The king kept getting recognized. The fatal mistake happened in the town of Saint-Ménehould. The local postmaster, Jean-Baptiste Drouet, recognized the king's face from his portrait on a new banknote. He hopped on his horse, galloped ahead to the next town, Varennes, and blocked the bridge with a cart. The king was caught. The journey back to Paris was a slow, agonizing funeral procession for the monarchy. The crowds were silent and hostile. He wasn't just their king anymore. He was a traitor who had abandoned his people. The flight to Varennes was a political catastrophe. It destroyed what little credibility Louis had left. Any hope for a constitutional monarchy was shattered. The idea of a republic, once a fringe concept, was now mainstream. The assembly tried to save face with a flimsy story that the king had been abducted, but no one believed it. The bond between king and people was broken forever. The flight to Varennes fatally wounded the monarchy. The next year would deliver the death blow. In April 1792, France declared war on Austria, and it started disastrously. The army was a mess. Marie Antoinette was, correctly, suspected of leaking military secrets to the enemy. Paranoia swept Paris. The final trigger was the Brunswick Manifesto. The commander of the invading army issued a proclamation threatening to burn Paris to the ground if any harm came to the royal family. It was meant to terrify the revolutionaries into submission. It did the exact opposite. For the people of Paris, it was definitive proof that Louis was in league with France's enemies. It was the last straw. On August 10th, 1792, a massive armed crowd marched on the Tuileries Palace. The royal family fled to the assembly for refuge. At the palace, a brutal battle erupted. The king's 900 loyal Swiss guards fought heroically, but they were overwhelmed. The battle devolved into a horrific massacre. The insurrection of August 10th was the Second French Revolution. The assembly had no choice but to bow to the victors. They formally suspended the king and imprisoned the royal family. The monarchy was over in all but name. On September 21st, 1792, the newly elected National Convention met for the first time. One of its very first acts was to formally abolish the monarchy. The next day, September 22nd, was declared the first day of year 1 of the French Republic. After 1,000 years, the French monarchy was dead. The commoners had won the war they declared in that tennis court. The king was gone, but let's be clear, the revolution was far from over. In fact, its most violent and terrifying chapter was just beginning. The fall of the monarchy would lead to the Reign of Terror, the rise of Maximilien Robespierre, and a struggle for the very soul of France. To see what happens next in this incredible story, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. The truth was, the journey from the Estates General to the First Republic was one of the most dramatic power shifts in all of human history. It was the story of how the 98%, silenced and exploited for centuries, found their voice and seized their own destiny. They tore down a feudal system that had stood for a millennium and gave the world a new vision of human rights. But the birth of the Republic wasn't an end. It was a new beginning, one that would lead France and Europe into the uncharted and bloody waters of war, terror, and the rise of an unknown Corsican general named Napoleon Bonaparte. How the French Revolution changed life for the 99%. When you think of the French Revolution, what pops into your head? Be honest. Is it the guillotine? A bunch of nobles in powdered wigs losing their heads? Maybe that slogan, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité? Let me know in the comments what you think of first. It's always fascinating to see. For decades, our idea of the revolution has been all about the big, dramatic, Hollywood-ready moments. We focus on the handful of famous people and the political chaos. But while the drama makes for a good story, the truth is, that's only a tiny piece of what actually happened. What if I told you that for the vast majority of people, the 27 million farmers, laborers, and shopkeepers who were the 99%, the revolution wasn't really about the terror. It was about the end of a system that had crushed them for centuries and the sudden shocking start of a new world. For them, the biggest changes weren't measured in beheadings, but in bread. Not in political speeches, but in the brand new right to own the land they worked. We're going to look past the guillotine and uncover how the French Revolution fundamentally and permanently changed the daily lives of ordinary people, from the ground up. To get the sheer scale of the change, we have to step into the world before the Revolution, a world called the Ancien Régime, the old regime. And let's be clear, for the average person, this world seriously sucked. It wasn't glittering palaces, it was a life of mud, sweat, and rules that made no sense, all dictated by who your parents were. French society was split into three groups: the estates. At the top, the first estate, the clergy. About 130,000 of them, controlling 10% of France's land. They ran everything from schools to hospitals, and crucially, paid almost zero taxes. Next, the second estate, the nobility. About 400,000 people who owned a massive 25% of the land and got all the best jobs in the government and military. And you guessed it, they were also exempt from most taxes. Their power was inherited, a birthright that basically made them a different species in the eyes of the law. And then there was everyone else, the third estate, the 99%. This was everybody from rich city merchants to the peasants working the fields. And despite being over 27 million people, the economic engine of the whole country, they had zero political power and paid for pretty much everything. Let's imagine a typical peasant. We'll call him Jean. Jean doesn't own his land. He works a plot owned by the local nobleman, the seigneur. His entire life is a web of ancient feudal payments. A chunk of his harvest, the champart, goes straight to the lord. But it gets worse. This is where the system becomes just maddening. The lord owns the only mill to grind your grain, the only oven to bake your bread, and the only press for your wine. To use them, which you have to, you pay a fee called the banalités. There's no choice. Using another oven is illegal. So, to feed your family, you have to pay the guy who already owns everything. On top of that, you owe the Lord several days of free labor every year, the corvée. Whether it's fixing his roads or his house, that's time stolen from your own farm. Some peasants were even serfs, legally chained to the land, unable to leave without permission. But Jean isn't done paying. He owes a tithe to the church, about 10% of his income, which was supposed to help the local parish, but often went to fund some bishop's lavish lifestyle hundreds of miles away. And then the king's tax collector shows up. Jean gets hit with the tile, a direct tax on land and income that the other two estates didn't have to pay. But the most hated tax of all was the gabelle, the salt tax. Salt was essential for preserving food, and the state had a total monopoly. Every family was forced to buy a certain amount of salt each year at a ridiculously high price, whether they needed it or not. The injustice was infuriating. So let's tally that up. A slice of your harvest to the Lord, a fee to the Lord to bake your own bread, free labor for the Lord, a tenth of your income to the church, and a pile of taxes to the king. In a good year, your family barely survived. In a bad year, they starved. And in the late 1780s, the years were very, very bad. A bad harvest and a brutal winter sent bread prices through the roof. A worker in Paris could spend 80% of his daily wage on bread alone. Beyond being broke, you had no rights. If Jean had a problem with his lord, he had to go to the seigneurial court, where the lord himself was the judge. Good luck with that. There was no freedom of speech. Criticize the king, and you might get a visit from someone holding a lettre de cachet, a royal order that could lock you up indefinitely, no trial, no appeal. Your freedom, your property, your life were not your own. They were held at the mercy of a system built to serve the few by crushing the many. This was the world of the 99%, a world of humiliation and rage just waiting for a spark. By 1789, France was a tinderbox. The kingdom was bankrupt, partly because it helped fund the American Revolution, a beautiful irony that was not lost on people now dreaming of their own liberty. King Louis XVI, a decent guy but a terrible decision-maker, was out of ideas. So he did something that hadn't been done in 175 years. He called a meeting of the Estates General, an old assembly with representatives from all three estates. He thought it would save the old system. Instead, it lit the fuse that blew it all up. As part of this, communities all over France were asked to write down their complaints in documents called the Cahiers de Doléances, the lists of grievances. You can still read thousands of them today, and they are basically the world's angriest suggestion box. Peasants demanded an end to feudal dues. Workers complained about the price of bread. The middle class, the bourgeoisie, used Enlightenment ideas to demand a constitution and basic rights. For the first time, the 99% had a voice, and it was a national scream of frustration. When they all met at Versailles in May 1789, the rigged game was obvious. Traditionally, each estate voted as one bloc. This meant the clergy and nobility, the 1%, could always outvote the third estate, 2-1. The representatives of the 99% knew that nothing would ever change this way. So, on June 17th, they did something radical. They just declared that they were the new government, the National Assembly, the true voice of the French people. 3 days later, they found themselves locked out of their meeting hall. So they gathered in a nearby tennis court and swore an oath, the famous tennis court oath, not to quit until they had written a constitution. This was a direct challenge to 1,000 years of monarchy. The king started gathering troops. People in Paris panicked, thinking he was about to crush the assembly. They needed weapons. On July 14th, a huge crowd marched on the Bastille, a medieval fortress and royal prison. To them, it wasn't just a building. It was a giant stone middle finger from the king, a symbol of his oppressive power. After a bloody fight, the people took the fortress and tore it down, brick by brick. The fall of the Bastille was the point of no return. It showed everyone that the king could be beaten. Across the countryside, this sparked the Great Fear. Peasants, hearing rumors and fearing retaliation from the nobles, decided to strike first. They stormed their lords' castles, not to loot, but to find and burn the feudal charters, the legal papers that had bound their families for centuries. It was like they were deleting the terms and conditions of their own oppression. The spark had been lit, and the whole rotten structure of the Ancien Régime was starting to burn. The Great Fear sent a shockwave through the National Assembly. The deputies realized they were riding a hurricane of popular anger. To calm things down, they couldn't just condemn the peasants. They had to fix the reason they were so angry. What happened next was one of the most wild, transformative nights in history. On the night of August 4th, 1789, in a session full of patriotic emotion, one nobleman stood up and did the unthinkable. He gave up his own feudal privileges. Then another did, and another. For hours, nobles and clergy rose one by one to surrender their ancient rights. By sunrise, the world had been rewritten. The assembly passed decrees that officially wiped out the entire feudal system. The tithes to the church, gone. The lords' private courts, gone. The right of nobles to hunt through a peasant's crops, gone. The corvée, forced labor, gone. The banalités, fees for the lord's mill and oven, gone. In a single night, the entire legal and economic system that had defined life for centuries was dismantled. For our peasant Jean, this meant he was no longer legally the property of his lord. He was free. The psychological chains were broken. He wasn't a subject anymore. He was a citizen of France. 3 weeks later, the Assembly laid the foundation for the new world with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Its opening line was a thunderclap. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Let's break down what this meant. Think of it this way. The law is now the same for everyone. Taxes are for everyone. You can say what you think without getting thrown in a dungeon. No more lettres de cachet. And most important, power comes from the people, not the king. Next, the Assembly turned to the biggest landowner in France, the Catholic Church. To solve the massive national debt in November 1789, the state did something shocking. It nationalized all church property. It basically said, "We're taking all your land to pay our bills. Thanks." This shattered the church's economic power and created a new class of landowners as peasants and bourgeoisie bought up the land. They followed this up by making priests and bishops paid state employees who had to swear an oath to the new nation. This split the country, but it was a massive step in separating church and state. The state, not the church, was now the final authority in public life. Together, these changes completely tore down the old world. The estate system was dead, feudalism was gone, the church was broken. For the 99%, this wasn't just politics. It was a life-altering earthquake that promised an end to centuries of inferiority and the start of a new age of dignity. The promises of 1789 were incredible, but the road ahead was pure chaos. Tearing down an old world is a messy, brutal business. For the average person, life got a lot harder before it got better. The economy was a disaster. The government started printing paper money called assignats, backed by the value of the church land they'd seized. But they couldn't stop printing it. The result? Hyperinflation. By 1795, an assignat was worth less than 1% of its original value. For the urban poor in Paris, this was a nightmare. Prices for food shot up, but wages didn't. Your life savings could barely buy you a loaf of bread. Then came the terror. From 1793 to 1794, the government, led by Maximilien Robespierre, unleashed a period of state-sponsored paranoia and violence. While we all picture nobles on the chopping block, the truth is, the vast majority of the terror's victims were ordinary people. Over 70% of those executed were peasants and workers. A new law made it so that a careless word or a neighbor with a grudge could get you sent to the guillotine. The promise of justice was replaced by paranoia and fear. And those universal rights? Turns out, they weren't so universal. The new Constitution of 1791 created active and passive citizens. To be an active citizen, to vote, you had to be a man over 25 who paid a certain amount in taxes. This cut out half the adult men in France, the poorest ones who had fought the hardest for the revolution. So, you helped overthrow the system, but you're too poor to vote. Tough luck. The old aristocracy of birth was replaced by a new aristocracy of wealth. And women were the backbone of this thing. It was the women of Paris who marched on Versailles and dragged the king back to the city. They formed political clubs and wrote pamphlets. Yet when it came to rights, passive citizens, by default, they were given some civil protections but were completely shut out of politics. The promise of equality clearly had its limits. So while the revolution tore down the old world, the new one was a contradictory mess. It was a time of incredible legal freedom, but also terrifying violence. A time that declared all men equal, but denied a voice to the poor and to all women. The price of revolution was steep, and the 99% paid most of it. The chaos eventually ended with Napoleon Bonaparte. And while he called himself emperor, he wasn't interested in going back to the old ways. In many ways, Napoleon hit save on the revolution's biggest social changes, making them permanent. His most important legacy was the Napoleonic Code of 1804. Before this, France was a confusing mess of different regional laws. Now, there was one single unified rulebook for everyone. The code cemented the revolution's core ideas: equality before the law, no more feudal privileges, and the protection of private property. It confirmed that merit, not birth, was what mattered. The social revolution was now permanent. The economy was changed forever. Getting rid of feudalism and selling off church land created a nation of small, independent peasant landowners. This class of smallholders would become the foundation of French society for the next 100 years, and smashing the old guild system opened up the economy for everyone. Even things we take for granted came from this. Take the metric system. Before the revolution, weights and measures were a disaster, different from town to town, often rigged by the local lord. The revolution introduced the logical system of meters, grams, and liters. This wasn't just a technical fix, it was a political one. It was a tool of equality that made trade fair and simple for everyone. Deeper than that, the revolution created a new identity. People were no longer subjects of a king, they were citizens of a nation, equal members of a community with both rights and duties. This new idea of nationalism was powerful. The blue, white, and red tricolour flag became its symbol. And finally, here's a great little piece of trivia. The revolution created the very terms left wing and right wing. During the assembly debates, the radical deputies sat on the left side of the room, and the conservatives sat on the right. That accident of seating gave us the political spectrum we still use today. The chaos and bloodshed were real, but they were the birth pangs of a new kind of world. For the 99%, life was remade. The legal chains were broken, equality before the law was established, and the idea that your life should be determined by your talent, not your great-grandfather's title, finally took hold. If you found this look at the real impact of the French Revolution interesting, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more history that goes beyond the textbooks. And let us know in the comments, what's one aspect of your modern life that you think has its roots in the French Revolution? The story of the French Revolution is so much more than a tale of beheadings and political drama. When we stop looking at the elites and focus on the millions of ordinary people, we see its true, massive impact. For the 99%, the revolution was a clean break with the past. It was the messy, violent, and ultimately successful struggle to tear down a system built on their subjugation. It meant the end of paying a lord for the right to bake your own bread. It meant the end of being legally second class. It meant the chance to own your land, speak your mind, and be judged by the same laws as a noble. While the full promises of liberty, equality, and fraternity weren't delivered to everyone right away, the revolution set a new standard. It established the principle that rights are universal and that the people are the true source of power. The French Revolution isn't just a historical event, it's the blueprint for the modern world. Its echoes are in our laws, our ideas of human rights, and our belief in democracy. It's a powerful testament to how a society can be torn down and rebuilt from the ground up, forever changing life for the 99%.